Thank you so much for joining us here today. It's really great to see so many people here. My name is Carrie. I'm the head of movement coaching here at Neon, and I'm your host for this webinar, which is the first of 3 webinars entitled Running Successful Movement Organizations, Introducing 3 Practical Toolkits. Today, we're here to talk about all things organizational strategy and introduce 2 of the tools that are featured in this toolkit to give you a bit of a taster of what this is all about. And I've got 3 amazing speakers here with me today, Charlotte, Fran, and Dan, who I'll introduce shortly, and they're going to help me with that. Okay, just a quick run through of what's going to happen over the next hour. I'll start with a short introduction to Neon and provide a bit of background and context about the toolkits that we've developed. I will then introduce you to our speakers for today, and we'll start by clarifying what we mean exactly by organizational strategy. This is something I'm sure that many of you will have your own ideas and perspectives on, but we'll be aiming to clarify the understanding and approach that we have used in this toolkit. We're then going to dive into the 2 tools that we're here to look at, which is the Empty House Systems Analysis tool and a Theory of Change Development tool, and run through how these work in practice. And my speakers are here to help me with that. There is going to be time for questions throughout. You'll see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, so just drop your questions in as we go. We'll pause after each tool so you can ask questions specific to that, and then at the end we'll have a little bit of time for any sort of broader strategy questions, so do kind of drop the questions in. I'll be keeping an eye on what's coming in. We might not be able to answer everything, but we'll certainly try. Afterwards, you'll get a link to download the toolkit, as well as links to where you can get further support from Neon. So you'll get all that information in your inbox tomorrow. Okay, so on with the introduction. For those of you who don't know Neon, we exist to support and strengthen social justice movements, and we do this through 2 core strands of work. Our movement building team delivers training, coaching, and group facilitation for organizers, campaigners, and other movement leaders to build individual and collective skills, capacity, and resilience. Our comms team delivers spokesperson and press officer training and does messaging and framing work on how to get progressive messages out into the world and widen political discourse and representation. And all of our work is supported by our fabulous ops team, who do not get a lot of public FaceTime. And they do all the behind the scenes work to make sure that Neon runs well as holding and driving Neon's culture and values. A big part of the work that we do here at Neon, both externally through our programs, in particular our org builders and help desk programs, as well as internally through the work of our ops team, is to think very deeply about how organizations function and what makes for healthy movement organizations. We understand that as being organizations that are strategically focused, that have a really clear vision of the future that they're trying to achieve through their work, and a really clear understanding of how they are going to make that change. And they're also organizations that think about how to make that vision a reality within their own organizations now, working with a really clear set of values and principles, seeking to consciously create progressive, inclusive, and liberatory cultures within their own organizations. This is the principle that underlines the 3 toolkits that we've developed. As I said, we're here today to talk about the first one on organizational strategy. And next week, we're doing 2 further webinars on organizational culture and structure and operations. And these 3 toolkits draw together the work that Neon is doing and has been doing both internally within our own organization, in working with others through our programs. And we're also bringing together the work of so many amazing organizations across the world, organizations, collectives, individuals, people who have really good insights, who spend a lot of time thinking very deeply here. And we've kind of aimed to provide a sort of entry point, a reference point, to where you can go deeper and further if you want to. So as I said, today we're here to talk about organizational strategy and share with you 2 tools and approaches to help you deal with this. We're joined by Dan Vokins, who is one of the executive directors here at Neon. Charlotte Miller, who is now an independent strategist and coach and was originally the co-founder of Neon alongside Dan. Both of them have a whole heap of practical experience in developing and delivering strategies for movement organizations, and they have each developed tools that have helped them along the way that are in this toolkit. We're also joined here by Fran Boyd, the Executive Director of Positive Money, who has used one of these tools and can share a bit about what that's like from her perspective. Okay, I think that's probably quite enough from me as an introduction. So I'd like to welcome Dan to kick us off by starting off with answering the question, what is organizational strategy? Dan, welcome. Please tell us, what does this mean?
Hi, really good to be here. And also, I just want to give a massive big up to the work that Carrie's done putting these 3 toolkits together over the last 6 months. It's a really powerful set of resources for the movement. So really exciting to be able to share them. Would it be possible to put the slides up, please, Grace? So yeah, I'm going to just spend a couple of minutes explaining what I think organizational strategy is. And I'm going to start by passing the buck or the responsibility to a guy called Marshall Gans, who I think summed it up as best as I've seen it. So next slide, please. And he says the strategy is turning the resources you have into the power you need to win the change that you want. I could break that down for a second because there's some quite important components of that sentence doing some work. So strategy is turning the resources you have, i.e. the things that you can control, the relationships you have, the money you might have, the people you might have inside your network, into the power that you need. So how do you take that set of resources and make it useful so that it can actually go to work and achieve a thing to win the change that you want? So being very clear about how you're being directed with these things. And I think if you've been involved in campaigning or movement organizing for any length of time, you'll know that in plenty of cases, and there are plenty of examples that we've all been part of, where we don't use the resources that we have well, we don't know the change that we want to end up winning, we don't transform that into power. And so I think strategy is often kind of looked down on or seen as writing a document that you go back to once every 3 years. But flipped on its head, it's actually the most important question, if you like, or one of the 3 kind of most important questions that you can be asking about how you use your very limited and precious resources, however big or small those are, to make the change that you want to see. So the first thing that I'd advocate for around strategy is actually spending time on it and really delving into the things that sit behind there. Because what often happens with it is we will be operating with a strategy. We'll be doing the same thing that we've done for the last couple of years, and there is an implicit strategy sitting behind that, but it's not been made explicit. And so without making it explicit and really working out what our plan is to win on this thing, you can fall into the trap of just repeating the same failed experiments, the same failed ways of going about doing things. And so good strategy really answers the question why are we here? What is our unique role in the movement? And how do we intend to execute it? Good strategy provides the alignment that you and your team need to stay on track, and also to be able to make really clear, quick, strategic choices about what you're going to do and what you're not going to do, so that you can actually get to work and do really effective movement organizing. So anyway, that's my kind of pitch for strategy and why it's important and how you actually make it practical inside the organization. It allows you to move really nimbly and fast, and when something happens like COVID or a new kind of moment in the movement that you're working in, you're able to pivot really quickly. So that's kind of at a high level. And then if we can move on to the next slide, we've developed this arrow, which kind of breaks down what a strategy is and tries to explain how it all fits together. And so on the right hand side, so you basically see your strategy is an arrow, and that arrow essentially represents your organization and all the work that you're going to do. On the right-hand side of that arrow, you have a problem block, if you like. And what you're trying to do is be really clear about what that problem is and what the vision is on the other side of it that you want to get to. Like if your organization over this strategy period is really successful, what is the place that you will end up and what is the problem that you need to have tackled in order to get there? And being really specific about that matters. And that's one of the things that Charlotte and Fran are going to talk about in a second, because that's often underlooked at. Once you're really clear about what the problem is and the vision that you're trying to get to, then the question is, like, what is the purpose of your organization? Like, there are a million different ways to solve a problem. What is the way that your organization fits into this puzzle, fits into the broader movement, if you will, because there are lots of different groups doing lots of different things. Then moving further along the arrow, what are the goals that sit behind that? What are the realizable sort of headline things that your organization is going to try and get done over that strategy period? And we would normally say a decent organizational strategy would be somewhere between sort of 1 to 3 years to actually sort of get work done. Probably on the shorter end of that when you're brand new and starting out, because you're testing so many assumptions. Probably if you've been around a bit longer, slightly longer. So yeah, what are the goals over that strategy period? And then how do the campaigns, the programs, and the activities that your organization do, how do those stack up to push forward that arrow so that all of your work is directed towards hitting that problem and smashing through that problem with the kind of focus of the strategy? And backing all of that up at the end of that arrow, you can see what we call structure there, which is essentially like, how do you make decisions? Who's in what teams? Like, who owns what bits of work? Like, all the things that sit behind all of this. But if you don't have them right, then the organization falls apart, or you have infighting, or you can't work out who's going to be doing what. And so organizational strategy is essentially these things here. And we would kind of, I'm going to talk a little bit about theory of change a little bit later, from how you get from where you are to where you want to be. And that represented in this arrow is the kind of direction of the arrow. If you get a really good theory of change, then it points your arrow directly at that problem so that you can power through it. And so you see a strategy is multi-layered. It has some long-term kind of big vision and problem, but it also gets quite specific. It allows you to go from, like, here's where we are right now, and here's all how we line up all the bits of the organization so that it's all super strategic and aligned, so that we can make the very, very best use of our extremely limited resources. And that's true whether you're like a brand new grassroots startup group of like 3 or 4 people, or like a large like trade union with several hundred staff and hundreds of thousands of members. Like, the importance of aligning all of those resources so that you can all go in the same direction is a universal problem, but also like the key to doing this stuff well. So yeah, that's organizational strategy as we see it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dan. That was a very excellent introduction. I'd now like to welcome Charlotte. Firstly, Charlotte, if there's anything that you want to add to Dan's definition.
No, that was brilliant. Thank you, Dan. I agree with everything you said. I think it's probably better to just delve into one of the tools now.
Excellent. Welcome. So Charlotte's going to help introduce the empty house model of systems analysis. Please take it away.
Great. So hi, everyone. It's great to be here, and I'm excited that so many other people are excited about strategy. So what I'm going to cover is I'm just going to give you a little bit of history of where this model came from and why we developed it, and then kind of take you through the model, the different parts of it, and give some examples, talk about the benefits of it. And then I'll be handing over to Fran, who is going to talk us through how Fran has applied it in her organisation, Positive Money. And then there'll be time for some questions at the end of hearing from both of us. So firstly, just a little bit of history. So Dan and I are co-founders of Neon, and one of the things that we did quite a lot of in the early days was supporting organizations who wanted to shift their organizational strategies to work on economic systems change, but they kind of knew that they were moving from a single issue that could have been, many different things. It could be climate, it could be an aspect of inequality, but they wanted to situate that within a wider analysis of economic systems change. And through many of these strategy sessions, we started to deduce where some of the gaps in people's thinkings were. And it kind of fell into two categories. Grace, if you could just put my slides up, that'd be great. So if you just go, yes. So the first kind of category of issues was around rushing to solutions. So I've just got this quote up here that from Einstein, that if he had 1 hour to solve a problem, he'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solutions. That we realized that if people wanted to have effective strategies, particularly around something as complex as systems change, that they needed to spend more time analyzing the problems that they were tackling. And if they didn't do this, then their strategy just wouldn't be on point and they would reduce their impact. And all of those things that Dan was talking about with the arrow, it just won't be as powerful. And then if we could just pull the next slide up. So the second kind of category of gaps in people's thinking were around that they were looking at things as individual issues without analysing the kind of systemic or structural root causes that give rise to those issues. Now, I know this is a bit of a long quote, but it's basically like, if you look at that first bit, you can tear a factory down, but if the mindset which underpins that factory is still there, another one will just pop up and you end up playing a kind of game of whack-a-mole endlessly without actually shifting anything in the long term. So that what we found we were supporting organizations to do was to go deeper and look at kind of deeper structural issues that underpinned the problem that they thought they were grappling with. And so when I say structural issues, I mean things like the power base, in whose interest does the system operate? What are the values and principles that underpin the issues that you're grappling with? And that kind of, if I had to sum it up, we were trying to move people away from thinking that they needed just a simple technical fix to the issue that they were working on, to seeing their work as actually is about ideological change, that really to create the kind of change that they were talking about was, we're talking about having a new power base and a new set of values and principles to underpin a different kind of system. So what we did was we kind of literally on a bit of A4 paper, we drew out this model, and then we tested it again and again through the one-on-one support with organizations that we were doing, and then through several of NEON's training programs. And then we've ended up now with the next slide. Thank you. So this is the house model. And I should maybe say that actually the full original name of the model was the House of Hayek. And Hayek was one of the architects of neoliberal capitalism. And I won't go into all of that, but really, I guess in a way, what we really wanted to instill in the people we were working with is that we can be architects too, that we can think just as deeply about the kinds of systems that we want to see in the world, and like, how do we think critically about that? And we basically broke it down into its component parts. And so like the house metaphor, you know, you have things under the ground that you can't see. You have foundations that hold up the house. And then you have pillars, like real structural important, that give power, that hold the house up. And then there's the things that you kind of really see, the outcomes, the priorities, and the narratives, the stories that we're told about this system. So just to give some examples, or well, I'm going to give an example of a campaign that NEON has been incubating, and Dan is going to pick up in the Theory of Change section, called Nurses United. So what this campaign has done is thought very carefully about the problem that it's tackling, and like developed strategies that could help kind of shift some of those deeper systemic issues around the way that nursing is perceived in the UK and how it's resourced. So you could say that this campaign is trying to put the interests of nurses at the forefront instead of you know, other interests that are trying to squeeze out and dismantle the NHS. It's trying to put values and principles of care and cooperation at the heart of a healthcare system, instead of a healthcare system that is kind of, you know, overshadowed by the interests of large corporates. And then the pillars of power is trying to put workers in there as a key pillar of power, that, so if we had a different healthcare system that prioritized workers, that nurses themselves would be seen as a powerful part of that system. It's trying to challenge the narrative that we have around healthcare, and challenge the narrative around key workers. So who is an essential worker in British society? You know, is it corporate interests, or actually is it people who care for us when we're sick and vulnerable? And then to change the priorities of a healthcare system that would be about the dignity and welfare of its workers and about health and well-being for all, and that would have very different outcomes to the kind of health, the way we deal with health at the moment. So that's just, and Dan, you can correct any errors I've made there, you can pick up in your theory of change section. But I think, you know, that is a campaign that has thought very critically about the kind of change that it wants to see, and also, you know, how to tell those stories, the narrative, and who tells those stories about the kind of change we want to see, is a really powerful example. And then just finally, to conclude my little bit, is to talk about some of the benefits of this model. And so there's this model, but there's also any model that supports groups to think, to apply systems thinking, essentially, to analysing the problem that they're dealing with. And Dan's already spoken about this, that it's a chance to align your team and key allies and build a shared understanding of the problem that you're trying to grapple with, and get out all of your assumptions about how you think, what are the systemic issues that keep upholding the issues that you care about. And also it's a chance to have constructive disagreement. So I think groups can fall apart over these kind of different competing analyses, can cause groups to fracture. And if you have a way of unpacking your assumptions around these kind of issues in a very structured and safe way, then yes, if you do disagree, then you can kind of unpack that together and hopefully create a richer understanding of the problem through having that kind of nuanced discussion, rather than just disagreeing with each other about the differing analyses. And I think finally, just to speak to the Marshall Gantz quote, getting really clear about the change you want to see. Like, if you get really clear on the problem that you're dealing with, then you're much more likely to be clear about the alternative to that, the change you want to see, and be able to kind of get out there and fight for it. That's everything from me. I'm going to hand over to Fran, who's going to talk about applying this model in practice.
Great, thanks, Charlotte. And yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for inviting me. It's really great to be here. So I'm just going to run through how we applied the house model of positive money. So we did a strategy process last September to November. We had a series of facilitated online sessions, and we wanted to bring together all our staff and all of our board to develop our 5-year strategy, which might be a bit long according to them. I think it's important for the kind of big systems change we're thinking about. And to do that, we use different tools for systems analysis, which is particularly important for assessing the problem, as we've heard. The first one we used in our strategy discussions with the house model, and we were really wanted to make sure everything was on the table for discussion. So although positive money focuses on money, banking, finance, economics, that sits within wider systems that can have to be analysed for a better, more true understanding and a better picture of what is required for systems change. And I think what was important going into the strategy process was that these strategy discussions, especially around systems change, are messy and incomplete and complex. But it is crucial to have the space to discuss them in order to kind of build a shared and collective understanding of the problem, which is really the foundation of a strategy, is a shared analysis of the problem. And only then can you really build on what you're trying to do to change that problem. And I think models are really vital, especially when we're looking at systems, in terms of how you facilitate the discussion, because they basically provide different lenses or different pairs of glasses to view systems. And I think we can get quite bogged down in the complexity, as I mentioned, and models can be a really useful way to cut through. It was really important that everyone was in the room for us during our strategy discussions. So we had everyone from the chair to the ops team. There's about 20 of us, and so had to be quite carefully facilitated. And I felt going in, kind of leading the process, it was a real opportunity for us as an organisation to kind of unpack everything and look at intersections we'd previously ignored to the detriment of our kind of analysis of the problems, such as how does the monetary and financial system intersect with colonialism and structures of oppression. And so by having this kind of quite well planned out process, it was like a real opportunity to bring lots of big important systems onto the table, which we hadn't kind of had the time or energy to unpack before. So I'll just go through our house model, which I think you can see already. It might, I think maybe because of the formatting, you've kind of got it in two halves, but I'll start at the bottom. So this is what we came up with. And actually there were kind of 20 houses. All of our staff members, all of our board members did their own house after like group discussions, and I kind of brought them all together with looking to kind of distill what the kind of highest almost what the kind of highest points were of each section, so that our kind of house could have the kind of biggest view, if you like, for going further and further up the mountain to see all these systems intersecting. That makes sense as an analogy. So in terms of the interests we came up with, the interests of our financial system serves the 1%, elites, asset owners, and global corporations. And then the values, which are the beliefs that motivate those interest groups that we decided on, were hierarchy, including patriarchy and white supremacy. We kind of felt it was important to bring out those, competition and individualism. And then the principles that put these values into practice we came up with were: free markets are neutral and efficient, a large dominant financial sector is a sign of economic success, meritocracy determines wealth and social standing in society, and technological change will always improve living standards for the majority of people, and automated processes driven by data are fair and do not discriminate. That's quite a long wordy one. But that we felt kind of brought that in at the end. If we think about, you know, Facebook, Google, these are things that have kind of have been more important in, I guess, the last 10 to 15 years, rather than some of the others, which, you know, are longer, 30, 40 years of neoliberalism, and then much longer in terms of white supremacy and patriarchy. So the kind of different timescales that we kind of can think about some of these principles, values, and interests that we see in the current system and all the problems it causes. So yeah, just kind of briefly running through the pillars of power. So we had this kind of state, so government, the Bank of England, the financial regulators, then the market, so the private sector, financial markets, banks, etc. Then the media, we decided was a critical power that upholds the system, sustains it. Then we wanted to bring in the educational elite, particularly mainstream academic economists, which also maintain the status quo and kind of stop new systems from emerging. And then our final one was multilateral financial institutions. So even though we're kind of trying to focus on the UK financial system, it's obviously global. So bringing in those multilateral financial ones as well. And then just on the narrative, which is a really critical part of the analysis of the problem, I think, that sometimes we miss. So what are the narratives which give the status quo their cultural strength? So we decided on there's no alternative as one, the richer wealth creators for everyone, this idea of trickle down. A key one for us is the narrative that money is scarce and those who have it as a result of hard work. A key narrative is racial oppression, gender inequality, wealth and income inequality issues of the past, which allow for kind of dismissing. And the key one for us is the UK economy needs a big finance for the City of London. And then the priorities we kind of came up with were GDP growth, private capital and wealth over public wealth and social values, and investor and short-term profit maximisation. And the outcomes: financialised economy, indebtedness, climate and ecological crises, housing crises, and rapid rise in inequalities. So quite a lot of stuff, but obviously we were really trying to unpack everything and not leave anything off the table. And so even distilling to those things was quite difficult. And yeah, I think we'll email our strategy document out afterwards. So if you've got any questions, do ask me. Just a few reflections in the last my last minute or so. I think, you know, the cognitive load is quite high, like this is quite difficult, and so I think realizing it can be overwhelming is quite important. So when you're thinking about designing a strategy process, like making space, it's really important that everyone feels safe and heard. So setting the framework so that everyone can be heard is very crucial. And, you know, even then some people felt the discussions were rushed because we were talking about so many different things at the same time and exploring quite big systems, but they still felt heard because we put so much time into the facilitation process. And it's really key in order to build trust in the process. Thinking about what material we can share before the sessions helps. In terms of outputs, I think also thinking about what you can share internally and externally can be tricky. And you know, as the person holding positive money strategy, then I did feel kind of exposed making it public. But actually it was really important that other leaders were like, you know, this is really positive. We need to share this with as many people as possible, not just our funders. And so we then shared it with kind of externally. And I think it's really important to give other people a sense of who you are as an organisation once you've done your strategy. We didn't share everything. It's a bit like a maths problem. You just don't want to share all the workings, just the answer. And yeah, just a couple of things on why strategy is avoided, I think, so often in us, not just our sector, but everywhere. And I think that's because it's hard, especially if you look at systems change strategy, it's harder still. And so we see it neglected in the private sector and government, in international. And I think when it is undertaken, it can be sometimes done in quite, as Charlotte said, people don't spend much time on the problem. So, you know, a full analysis of the problem is really key. It is complex and tricky, but it will make our analysis and therefore our actions more powerful. And, you know, I think in our sector, we can get in those day-to-day campaign battles and wins, and strategy, you know, can be in that important but not urgent box. So it gets deprioritized, doesn't get done, but it is quite critical in grounding an organisation, I think, especially for the kind of medium and long term. And I think one way that I found it easier was kind of thinking of the process of strategy as being as important as the final result. So then you're kind of taking the pressure off the final product and you're saying the process is crucial here. So let's have those conversations, and Neon's great toolkits provide the tools to have the conversations. That's all from me. I hope that wasn't wasn't speaking too fast. Sorry about that.
That was great. Thank you, Fran. That was, yeah, really, really informative and really useful to hear both kind of how the tool works in sort of theory and in practice. If anybody in the audience has any questions specifically to this tool, then do drop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen now. Don't worry if you're having some difficulty that kind of pulling single questions out of all the information that we have. We can revisit this at the end as well. I guess one question for me to start us off is, given the, I guess, you know, when we think about doing strategy work, as you said, you know, the process is important. What do organizations need to have, I guess, as like a grounding to be able to start this work? Like when is a good time to start, and what do they need to have in place to be able to engage with a sort of deep strategy process that gives it the time that it deserves? Charlotte, Fran, I'd love to hear any reflections on that.
Well, I can start, and then Fran, you can jump in. So I actually think the way that Positive Money did it is a real kind of role model of how to do it. That so it's seeing it as a series of conversations that build on each other. It's like putting a jigsaw together, and that you're going to do that carefully, and each piece you put in, you're going to spend some time looking at it, and then you're going to put it into the jigsaw. And it needs a heartbeat. So it kind of, you can't do this like bang it out in a day, particularly because it's a process of alignment, and it's a process of alignment around complex issues, and that are strongly felt by team and board and other, you know, your allies feel strongly about these issues. So it's like giving it space, a sort of heartbeat. And what Positive, and Fran, you can add more detail, but having like a monthly heartbeat, I think was really important. And that's what I always advise other organizations to see it as a kind of 3 to 6 month process, where you have probably a monthly session that is deep but not broad. So you go in deep on in different elements, and you do that together, but it needs it definitely needs like an editor who, and that could be more than one person, but somebody or some people who will hold the thread throughout the whole thing and then pull it together in the end as one document. Now, the document is not the key thing, but the power of the written, once you've got it there, that like it becomes a kind of, it's like the cake that you've baked together. Do you know what I mean? And although the process of being in the kitchen and like sharing ingredients and different ideas for what the cake could look like is really important, but it's really important to have the cake as well. Fran, do you want to share any?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I really agree with all of that. And I think, you know, it's kind of going into it, realizing it does take time. And I know that you can always feel like, oh, I don't want to take time out of everyone's calendar. And, you know, especially if you want to bring your board in, which I'd really recommend, because as Charlotte said, if you've got the cake you've all made, all of your board and all of your staff team, then no one can kind of say, well, that's not in the cake, because you put it in together. And that can be really helpful for when, you know, you're thinking about what you're working on, what's within scope and out of scope of the organization. Like if you've got a shared analysis that you've all worked on, but that does mean some negotiating. Like all of our board of volunteers, they, you know, couldn't do daytime, so we had to go into evenings. That was like also added to the cognitive load. So I think, you know, time is probably, you know, the one reason that people don't do strategy, and the one thing that you kind of need to be committed to in order to undertake a process. And, you know, the thing about having it, we had like 3 sessions over 3 months, which were quite, you know, long sessions, and we had a lot of contact in between, is it just gives time for kind of digesting and, you know, subconscious reflecting of what you've discussed, which again is crucial for alignment, because, you know, one deep dive, as much as you might get some content alignment, you also need to be aligned as a team, and those relationships can be also as key in terms of how those dynamics play out in the strategy process. So there is quite a lot of stuff going on at the same time in a strategy process. And I would say that the thing to start with is making sure the people running it are committed to giving it that time. And I know that's what we're all time poor. So I guess that's the place to start.
Yeah, we've had a question in, which is, what advice would you give to organizations that struggle to clear time to write a strategy? Which feels very, very like it links on nicely from what you just said, Fran. So yeah, how would you sum this up?
I mean, to an extent, you need to, people are basically going to be a bit, I mean, you're going to get some grumbles and some, oh goodness me, like, are we really having to put all these hours in our diaries? And that's totally normal, but kind of the belief in the process. And I'm not, you know, everyone at the other end of it were really pleased we'd gone through it. I guess it's like, you know, you're going on a journey together. A lot of people are a bit like, oh God, do we have to do this? But once you get to the other end, and in the, you know, people are really pleased because they look back at what you've kind of achieved, and they do feel that alignment. It's like it is a kind of emotional thing as well. So yeah, so I think kind of just being aware that you have to kind of have that legitimacy, right? So me as the exec director and our chair of the board, we had to be brought into it together to take it both to this whole staff team and the whole board and say, you know, we need to all come together. But it isn't, I'm not going to pretend it's easy and people won't grumble, because they will.
Yeah, I know we're like close to time, but so I'm leading a strategy process with a largely volunteer-based organisation. I'm based in Edinburgh, up in Scotland. There are some staff now, but it's a lot of volunteers. And the way we've done it is like be really clear up front about the different. So I've used tools from the toolkit, and I'm like, okay, session 1 we're going to do problem. Session 2 we're doing theory of change. And not everyone could make every session. So we've really kind of distributed, like you'd be really clear on the process and the tools. People know what they're coming to. We're doing the sessions in 1 evening a month across 4 months, we've done it. And then also have distributed the write-ups. So it's like, who's really, you know, you're going to get someone who loves vision, who's like, you know, oh, I love to like imagine and I'm creative. And then you've got like geeks who like theory of change. And so they've each taken different elements and wrote them up. So you can kind of distribute the work as well and play to people's natural kind of strengths and interests, which means it's less time for everyone then.
Great. Thank you, Charlotte. That's really good advice. We've got a couple of other questions here that feel like they connect to a sort of more broader strategy focus. I'm going to pick these up at the end. And now I'm going to invite Dan to talk about theory of change.
The geeky one who loves theory of change, according to Charlotte. Perfect. So the other thing that I would just quickly pick up on the question before about the time thing. Sometimes, like, imagine your organization like a tug of war, and you're all trying to move a rope across the ground. If like 1 or 2 people are pulling in a different direction, it cancels out like a couple of people pulling in the direction that you want to go. And so like the purpose, and we're going to keep saying this throughout this session, the key purpose is to align everyone so that you're pulling in the same direction. Because how many times do you have disagreements inside your organization about what the best way to go is? And like mostly they just get hidden. People just go do their own thing. And it's how like giant organizations with unbelievable resources achieve incredibly little. Yeah, that's a thing. Theory of change, another thing we need alignment on. So what is a theory of change? Why is it important? Next slide, please. So a theory of change is basically a set of assumptions about how doing X set of things will result in Y change at its most simple, right? How does doing X set of things result in Y change? Your theory of change is the way that you persuade people that your organization has a plausible plan or a plausible theory about how you can win. It inspires people, it binds people together in a collective pursuit, and is one of the backbones of your strategy. It's also probably the thing that strikes the fear into most people, because you can really go around a rabbit hole with it. So we've provided 4 different tools in the toolkit to allow you to go as deep as you like with theory of change. And there's some very deep places you can go around systems change and Donella Meadows and some other stuff. I'm going to give you the most introductory version of it here, or the most basic version that we've come up with around this. So can I have the next slide, please? So why is it important? So Carlos Saavedra from IANY, who is one of the founders of the Dreamers movement in the States, around undocumented rights in the US. He said about 80% of all disagreements in working from social change are disagreements about theory of change. And what he meant by that was essentially somebody's like, I think it's most important that we go and lobby the government. And if we're really careful with, like, let's say right now, Joe Biden in America, and we like create a bit of space for him, then that is the way to do it. Another person might say, like, no, I really disagree. We've got to like change public opinion on all of this. We're going to we really need to actually be shaming the Republicans. And another group might say, like, actually what we need to do is get local businesses on side. And if local businesses on side help, like, do X, Y, Z, or provide services, or not request like papers for undocumented migrants, then that's the best way of making progress. These are all disagreements about theory of change. Now, they're all like plausible routes to making, and this was true around DACA and some of the Dreamers movement. They're all plausible things that could potentially work. Your theory of change conversation is how you have those conversations out loud and make your best bet about the way of making change on this. So it's really, really important stuff. So theory of change is about basically unpacking all of those different possible ways you could make change happen, debating them and testing the assumptions behind it. Like, what's the reason that you think that thing? And let's argue about that rather than the way that we're going to do the thing. And then choosing one, aware of its pitfalls and its challenges, so that you can come back and have another go if that doesn't work in half a year or a year's time. So, what are the components of the most basic theory of change that we think it's useful to have a conversation about? Next slide, please. We think there are 4 categories that you can unpack this under. So what are the key barriers that we face? What are the biggest roadblocks or obstacles? So given that we know what the problem is, as we've just heard, like that we see all these things, what are the biggest problems that are stopping us winning the thing that we need right now? What are some of the key ways, the key intervention points we can imagine undertaking as an organization to move those barriers that we face? Like, what are some of the biggest ways that we can imagine doing that? What are the actions to make that happen? And they almost start to become your programs, right? The kind of things that you would actually deliver to make this happen now, to start making those intervention points work and knock down those barriers. And then finally, what are the assumptions we're making about how to achieve that change? Very often people leave those assumptions implicit and they don't make them explicit. And that means that you have all those arguments, but also you don't properly test your theory. So like the kind of assumptions that people always hang about with are things like, I think only government can make change happen, or I think government is completely irrelevant because they're never going to come round to my way of thinking. Or the only people that it makes sense to organize are people that are already converted to this. And if we just make them very active, like those are the kind of assumptions that sit behind a lot of campaigns, but aren't actually put out there. Now, you should get them out and then actually like argue about them and see if they make sense, because sometimes our deepest held assumptions on issues just aren't right. Okay, so those are the components. And what we ask you to do in this exercise is just go through as a group and write them out on Post-its, stick them on the wall, argue about them, and sometimes it will require some research and other bits and bobs. What I'm going to do is apply this in a really simple way to the Nurses United group that I was talking about, to give you some examples of what each look like. So key barriers the nurses were facing in terms of, can I have the next slide, please? Key barriers around nursing pay. This isn't all of them, it's not exhaustive, but it gives some examples. So the public agrees with the idea that nurses should have a pay rise, but right now the public's inactive. They don't care. They think, they believe in nurses, they think that nurses should get a pay rise, but they're not doing anything about it. So why are they not active? Nurses are very burned out after a long pandemic with poor working conditions. So it's a lot of energy for them to get involved and start a campaign. The government is against raising nurses' pay and has a large majority and is justifying it on the grounds that there just isn't enough money. And there's no clear demand for what nurses' pay should be. And the movement is disunified or ununified. That last one's not quite true, but you get the picture. That's the kind of thing that you might imagine around nursing pay. So if those are the biggest barriers, the things that you really, if you really boil it down, you think are stopping you from achieving your thing, what are some of the big interventions that you could make around that? Next slide, please. So it might be that you say a simple, clear pay demand that unifies the movement. So to build our power, remember, like building the power that we need to win the change that we want, like maybe it's a clear demand that unifies the movement. Maybe it's a campaign that turns passive allies, so all those people who agree with nurses and think that pay should be risen, but are currently inactive, like maybe it's to turn them into active allies in the fight for nurses' pay. And maybe the way to do that is an organized body of nurses who can lead the movement and persuade the public. So people directly affected by the issue, who have the most to win and lose from this, maybe they're the people who can be most trusted to shift the public on that. And so organizing frontline nurses is the way to do that. Those are some example interventions. Obviously, in the real thing, you would you'd be able to unpack that and like really jump into some more depth around that, which groups like Nurses United and lots of other people who are actually working on the NHS right now have done. I'm just giving a very surface example. So the next one that sits behind that is, what are some of the key activities that we would need to do to unpack that? So next slide, please. So then now you're like, okay, I have a sense of what the problems are. I have a sense of the key kind of components or campaigns or chunks of activity that are needed that we're going to have inside the organization to knock over that theory of change, to like knock over those problems. What are some of the, can I go back one? Sorry. Yeah. So then what are you going to do right now? What are the programs of work that sit behind that to make those interventions come to life? So for example, what we need right now is to set up a training for new activists led by nurses to get people organizing around local hospitals. So maybe a way that you can go and get allies who believe in nurses' pay to come out and organize around like hospitals as a local site. Maybe a thing is a listening exercise and a summit of key nursing groups to agree on joint demands. Maybe it's to find international organizations who've done this work incredibly well, like National Nurses United in the States, who have been doing a lot of work around single payer healthcare, or basically making an NHS in America, to learn from how they did it. And so you can bring over their organizations. So you'll see basically what we're talking about now on this bit is some quite practical small things that you actually start to work on to make those activities happen. This slide is where most people start. They're like, let's do a thing, let's do a thing, let's do a thing, let's do a thing. And you just have all this work that you do. But unless you've done those things before and you're clear that with your very limited resources, you're pointing at the very best problem and the very best intervention you can, you might be wasting some of those resources, and there might be ways to unlock issues that, despite people having worked on them for like months, years, decades, haven't been able to see a switch. An example of that was like getting some of the DACA reforms passed, for example, or some of the work that's going on. Well, I mean, basically when movements succeed, it's often not because there weren't people working on those issues before, it's because they found the most incisive trigger point to go in at the right moment and the right time, because they understood the problem, because they mobilized in the right way, and they shifted something that had already been there. So one of the ways we think is helpful to look at those shifts and to think about this is the assumptions, which is the next page. So basically, what are the assumptions that sit behind that? Nurses are powerful advocates for their own rights, that winning public opinion will force the government to act because they are so scared of the nurses' salience and how powerful and what a moral voice they are. That we need to embed organizing of nurses into the core of this model, because that's where the powerful come from. So basically, some of those things sound quite obvious, but it's really important to list them out so that you can really challenge that idea. So on something like nursing, for example, like Nurses United chose not to organize the public, and that all of their assumption was that their limited resources should go into organizing nurses themselves to be outriders around these issues. So you see that kind of conversation around nurses, because you could otherwise imagine a very big campaign of the public to win that, but that wasn't the way they chose to go. So next slide, please. Just a couple of other wrap-up points. Some of these have been covered, so I'll rush through them. You're likely working on a really complicated system. Like, there won't just be a XYZ thing. And so you're making some best guesses about the ways to intervene in a complex system. And you're unlikely to be the only people that are going to be able to solve this. So you should be thinking in like movement conscious ways. Like, what is the unique thing that your group can do as part of this? who should you be tying up with in the broader movement? Like, are there other people that you need to bring on board with this strategy, or who are already doing a bit of it so you don't need to do that bit? Power is the most important thing. Like, why does the situation look like it does right now? Someone probably has the power and interest to keep it in that way, as we were just talking about with the problem. What power do you need? Is it moral power? Is it like physical power? Like, what power do you need to switch that? And what is your assumption about how you'd get it? And all of this has to be informed by a really solid anti-oppression analysis from the outset, and your understanding of your role in that broader movement ecology. There's more tools in the toolkit about that. So that's that. And then a couple of quick tips for how to do this in practice. So next slide, please. How to run the exercise. Basically, put people together in a room for half a day and get out a whole bunch of Post-its, and on each one of those 4 points that I just said, like, get a bunch of Post-its up on the wall, have people go through them in silence to begin with, like write out the key barriers, and then start to cluster them on the wall so that you begin to see some themes, and then have discussions about them. What's the most challenging question you can ask yourself about them? And add any questions or additions to those answers as you go. And then at the end of that exercise, start to put sticky dots where you think the most pertinent, like, challenges, interventions, assumptions, and all those things are. And as Charlotte says, someone goes away, coordinates that, writes it up, and then you have a document that people can have a look at and you can test with different people. What you should end up here with, essentially, is, yes, maybe a long document that explains all this in quite a lot of detail. But I would say you want to end up with, like, pretty much a page, which really incisively, with some bullet points, is like, these are the biggest structural barriers. Here is our very simple intervention to get involved in that. Here's the work we're going to do to make that intervention come to life. And here are the assumptions that sit behind it. And the reason to keep it that simple is because if you can remember it without looking at the page, you will be able to very convincingly tell someone else, your activists, funders, the rest of your group, and everyone will get alignment around that. If this ends up being too, like, complicated in the end, what you're going to be working on through this theory of change, it won't stick. And it's very important to have something that's sticky, simple, and people can align behind. Done. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Dan. Yeah, we are very tight on time this evening, I guess it is now. So yeah, I think we're going to run a little bit over so that we can answer some of the questions that have come up. And just to follow on specifically from your sort of piece, Dan, how do you decide when your theory of change hasn't succeeded and it's time to try another?
Great question. I think if you've got a theory of change written down and you've really tested it, when you go back to it at your 6 month or 12-month or whenever it is review, because strategy shouldn't just be left on the shelf, like, it should be an active part of how you make decisions and move forward. Like, you shouldn't just do it and leave it. It should be when you go back to it and you don't think one of the assumptions is true anymore. Like, maybe you thought that Boris Johnson was amenable by shame, and then you're like, that is actually not true. All we have to do now is, like, close down the NHS or do some kind of direct action to force him, because public opinion is not enough. So it's basically when you think that one of the assumptions you made is no longer true, like, what you're doing is you're coming up with a hypothesis. That's what your strategy is. This is the best way I can think of. You're going out and you're testing it. And as soon as that is not true, come up with a new hypothesis, experiment, like, twist this stuff as quickly as you feel you can.
Great, thank you so much. We've had some really great questions in the chat that Charlotte and Fran have been answering as we go. And I wonder if there's anything that you want to particularly lift up from here. Maybe this one around sort of when you're operating in an environment where there's a lot of resistance would be good to sort of unpack a little bit here. So yeah, Charlotte, please take it away.
Yeah, that seems to be a bit of a theme in some of the questions, and I'm really sorry for you who are on the webinar that are facing that resistance. It's really hard. So I think in a way you almost need to think about it like, imagine it's a campaign. So you want to do a thing, but there's a powerful group that are blocking the change you want to see. So like, what do you need to do to either get around them or overpower them? And there's like different tactics you can deploy. I think if I had to pull out some kind of common themes in those tactics, it's like, do it anyway. Like form a team who are committed to that strategy process and run it anyway with the people who want to be in it. And then who can you get involved with that or partner with you or advocate for you to the people who are resisting the strategy process that this is really needed? Who are they going to listen to? If it's a funder who's blocking it, like, is there another funder who they might listen to? So an example is before Neon, I co-founded another organization that started out as a project. When I was inside an NGO, there was a ton of resistance to that project. But what we did is we found some allies outside of the organization who also believed in the project. And we were like, a bit like, well, screw you, we're going to do it anyway. And the allies were very influential to our organization. So because they believed in it, all of a sudden the narrative shifted and we're like, oh yeah, I think it's a really good idea and I think you should do it and blah, 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 blah. You know, it went to sort of active resistance to passive support. And it's like, so if you can, do what you can to do it anyway with the believers, and whose support can you get that might influence those that are resisting it? Even if it's like they don't get involved in the strategy process at all, you write it all up and then you gather support for it externally and then advocate back to the people who are blocking. Yeah, it's very hard and it's very wearing because doing a strategy process is demanding anyway, and doing it in the face of resistance is really hard. So emotionally build up your wee squad who can hold you through that. And it's a really very much like a very bonding experience to do this. So even if an outcome is you might start a spin-off thing yourselves. Do you know what I mean? So it's like you create a very strong unit through doing this together. So you will get strength from that, and you can use that strength to advocate to those who block it or find another, maybe there's another way. You won't know till you do the process, basically. Doesn't make it any easier, I get that. Yeah, don't know, Dan, you might have been in that position before.
The resistance one. Yeah, I basically agree with Charlotte. Like, find your people, align, and try and make it happen within that organization. If not, if you can, consider leaving.
Yeah, unfortunately, sometimes that's the answer. Yeah, quit. I see a lot of people doing that these days. So yeah, if that's an option, then take that chance as well. Thank you so much, Charlotte and Dan. It's been really great to have your input today, and really great to have your answers to these questions as well. Some really tough ones, and people are grappling with some difficult things. So useful to have your insight on this. And thank you also to the people who raised those questions. Yeah, I'm glad you felt able to do so in this space, and I hope this has been helpful. Yeah, Charlotte, anything to add there?
I've just seen the last question from Hannah about people who think, I think this is a common thread in our world, that people see strategy as something corporate and bureaucratic and what the other side do. So I would just point them to, like, if you look at the most successful movements that have created significant change, they will have been shit hot on strategy. So civil rights, like Dan quoted the founder of the Dreamers movement, like, these people are serious strategists. BLM, look how they've evolved and, you know, over time, and kind of burst out onto the scene. Like, that's some serious strategy there. So unfortunately, the right and the business sector are incredibly organized around strategy, and they have whole like MBAs that help them do it and everything. So it's like, it's a powerful weapon. So we might as well have it in our hands.
Exactly. Like, we have so few resources, like in some senses, like we have people basically and a small amount of money from like industrial kind of charitable kind of complex stuff. And so how we use those resources should be the most important question to us, because only what we do with the small amount of tools that we have that will grow the number of people and the amount of resources we have to ultimately shift the system, which means taking power. And so that is the key question. Like, what do we have to do today in order that we can do more tomorrow and more the day after that? And that is the question of strategy and why we should take it really seriously.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I hope that's answered that question, Hannah. I'm going to wrap up there. We are 6 minutes over. Thank you for those who stuck with us and for staying with us a little bit of extra time to be able to answer those questions. It's been absolutely brilliant to have Dan and Charlotte here. Fran's already had to shoot off, but yeah, big thanks to all of you for your time, for your energy, for sharing your expertise here today. Next steps, you can expect, as I said earlier, an email from us tomorrow. It'll have a link to the strategy toolkit that you can download. We've got 2 more webinars running next week. So on Monday and then on Thursday, same time, 5 till 6. Mondays is on organizational culture and Thursdays is on structure and operations. And if you want, there'll be information about the recordings as well in the email tomorrow. If you do want some additional support to help figure out, like, okay, there's these toolkits, but where do I start? What do I do? Then Neon has a program called the Help Desk, where we can match you with somebody who can, over sort of 1 to 3 sessions, give you a bit of a support, a bit of coaching on where to begin and how to sort of move this forward within your organizations. That program does other stuff as well, so there'll be some information about that in the email tomorrow as well. Thank you everyone for being here today. I hope you all have really wonderful evenings and we'll finish there.